We are in world history and we're on chapter 20, part 2, and we're going to be talking about the great preachers and missionaries of England during this time of the Victorian era, which is the 1800s, or we call it the 19th century. So one of the greatest preachers of England during this time was a man named Charles Haddon Spurgeon. And he was had London's largest church. In fact, they called him the Prince of Preachers. He had the same congregation for over 40 years, and he spoke to crowds up to 24,000 people in the Metropolitan Tabernacle in London. He ran almshouses for the poor to help the poor, and he founded 2 orphanages. He administered a Bible college. He wrote books, a monthly magazine. He used his publications for evangelism, education, and Christian charity. He was a great evangelist. And he came to the Lord at a pretty young age. He started out preaching very young. Other great preachers, we have F.B. Meyer, lived 1847 to 1929. And he was in great demand as a Bible teacher and speaker. He wrote all kinds of devotional studies and used Bible characters in many of them. And even today, his books are read very much even in the modern time. F.B. Meyer, another preacher. So a great preacher of the Victorian age. Now he was American, but he came to England and preached in England quite a few times. So he lived 1837 to 1899. He's a great preacher that everyone should know about. He had tremendous impact upon the people of England. He traveled to Britain in 1873, 1881, 1891 to preach the gospel in England. And he was always joined by his song leader, Ira Sankey, and he lived 1840 to 1908. So Moody spoke to huge crowds throughout England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. And he held revivals among all classes of the society, and it broke up. All classes of society broke out to come, and many thousands accepted Jesus as their Savior. He also encouraged the English missionaries to go forth into foreign missions. And so his call to missions was grand, and many missionaries went all over the world. So I love reading Dwight L. Moody's sermons, and pretty amazing man, very amazing man. The great century of missions, I call it the Church of Philadelphia, or the time, the missionary church. So we have quite a few here, and we'll be going over some of them. So I'm just going to mention C.T. Studd. He was a famous cricket player, and he spent his life as a missionary to China, India, and Africa. So he's a great missionary. On to Wilford Grenfell. He was a missionary to Labrador and Newfoundland. And of course we have William Carey. He spread the gospel to the ends of the earth. And so he's mainly focusing on India. J. Hudson Taylor, from England to China. And then of course Dr. David Livingstone, from England to Africa, into the Congo area. And then we have the sweet Amy Carmichael, and she was from Ireland to India. So here's some pictures up here. We have Amy up here, Amy Carmichael, and she went into India and brought a lot of the kids were being abused in some of the temple areas, and she came and rescued a lot of these young children. And then on to, of course, we have Hudson Taylor, which we're going to talk a little bit about there, went to China. Dr. Livingstone, Africa, C.T. Studd, and Grenville there. So Labrador. Great pictures. I love those pictures. Missions to China. Robert Morrison, he lived 1782 to 1834. He was Presbyterian, and he wrote the first Chinese dictionary and translated the Bible, the first translation of the Chinese Bible, preparing the way for other missionaries because he lived towards the 1700s. And then we have William Burns down here. Okay, this is Robert Morrison, and this up here is William Burns. And William Burns was a Presbyterian missionary to China. Also, the greatest missionary to China was J. Hudson Taylor. And he lived 1832 to 1905. And like I say, he was the greatest missionaries, one of the greatest missions, longest period in China. He was Methodist, and he was determined to depend on God alone. So when he went, he didn't depend on people to give him all the money that he needed, but he depended on God to bring in all that he needed into by faith into the missionary effort. So 800 missionaries caught his vision to reach millions in China. Millions came to the Lord in China during this time. Jonathan Goforth from Canada went to China. Here's Jonathan Goforth, born 1859, died 1936. And then we have John and Betty Stam right here. They were missionaries, and they were martyred in China, and they were from the United States. Jonathan Goforth was from Canada. And of course, J. Hudson Taylor from England. The Boxer Rebellion in China. So this was a hard time for missionaries because they were a Chinese terrorist group, and they were nicknamed Boxers because of the way they exercised like boxers. Here's a picture of one of the boxers. They called it the Boxer Rebellion. And they launched an attack on all foreign influences, not just missionaries, but all foreign people that came in. They wanted them all to be gone or killed them. The Boxer Rebellion destroyed property belonging to the Westerners, killed 200 people, many of whom were American and European missionaries were killed during this time. The Western nations sent an international rescue force out to rescue those who found refuge in the embassy. So basically, the Western nations, they knew that a lot of Americans and English and such missionaries would run to the embassies. So that's where they went to find to rescue a lot of people that would have been killed by the Boxer Rebellion. Despite this, you'd think that mission work would stop, but no. Under persecution, despite this, the following decade saw mission work prosper as never before. So even in these times of persecution and martyrdom and all these, only produces more missions, and more people getting saved. Missions to Japan. So Japan, we're talking about Japan because Japan remained closed for trades to foreigners. They were just totally closed up during the 1800s. So people knew very little about Japan. So until Commodore Matthew Perry convinced Japan to sign a treaty for trade and diplomatic relations with the United States. Here's Commander Matthew Perry. But the treaty did not allow missionaries at all. But it did help to unlock the door because now at least countries, especially America and England, could come into Japan and trade. So that's Commodore Perry. And then Townsend Harris. He was the first diplomat to represent Japan. He was a devout Christian with great faith and outstanding testimony, and he was really impressing the Japanese. They liked Townsend Harris. So as he was this diplomat, they decided to open up more, and in 1858, he persuaded the Japanese to sign the Treaty of Amity and Commerce, which is called the Townsend-Harris Treaty, which permitted missionaries then to go to Japan. So all of us in 1858, many people or missionaries set out to go to this unknown land, or this land that had been closed for many, many centuries. Jonathan Goebel, he was a missionary to Japan. He was no stranger to Japan at all, because as a young United States Marine, he had accompanied Commodore Perry in 1853. Remember, Perry is American, is coming into Japan. And so he had already been there, and he had learned the Japanese language so he can communicate with the Japanese. He was ready to preach the gospel when he arrived in 1860, but his wife, she developed this serious illness and she couldn't even walk. So you think that they would stay home, but no, they still went to Japan. So he invented in Japan, it's happened in Japan, he invented the world's first rickshaw to help her get around. And the rickshaw then became the mode of transportation in Japan. Can you imagine that? So he invented this rickshaw to pull his wife around so that she could go out with him on the missions. So amazing. And then since he was doing that, everybody, all the Japanese wanted one of those. Christianity and charity. There was selfless charity that burst forth in the 19th century. Never in history had so many people done so much for others. Many acts of benevolence were freely performed, compelled by the inner sense of duty and love from obedience to Scripture. So this picture here I put in there because this is one of my favorite evangelists that time, Lady Hope. And she actually went and spoke with Charles Darwin, before he died. And I won't get into that. But her testimony is that Charles Darwin came to the Lord before he died. And you know who Charles Darwin is? Yes, evolution. Even the greatest evolutionists that began, evolution can get saved. George Mueller, 1805 to 1898. George Mueller was a German missionary, a man of prayer and of great faith. He came to England as a missionary to the Jews at that time, but then he began founding orphanages for the forsaken children of Bristol, England. He saw all these kids, and so he founded an orphanage. And every day for years, God would miraculously provide for over 2,000 orphans in answer to George's prayers. It's like some of the accounts are that the kids didn't have any milk that week, and so he would pray, and then all of a sudden somebody would bring milk, would show up at the door. A milkman would show up at the door and someone would pay for it. It's amazing, but he definitely walked in faith. Over the years, thousands of children were clothed, fed, educated, and won to Christ in Mueller's orphanages. William Booth. Okay, can you see the Salvation Army? Yes, he was a Methodist evangelist. In 1865, he began missions in the darkest slums of London. And he believed the main problem of London's poor was not their destitute environment, but their sinful hearts. He said they need the Lord. So Booth dedicated his life to winning the indigent, that's the poor, to Jesus Christ and helping with their physical needs. In 1878, his ministry was known as the Salvation Army. Booth organized his converts in a military fashion and led them in a grand campaign to reach other needy people for Christ. So he would train them and they would go out themselves and reach people and help people, not only helping them spiritually, but physically too. The Salvation Army spread throughout England, Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, India, and South Africa. Amazing. Amazing how one man could go into the slums and start this organization that would reach the poverty areas of almost the entire world. The YMCA, Young Men's Christian Association. Many young men had moved to the cities to work in the new industries and the factories, and they faced a lot of temptations. They needed a place where they could stay, and they could get meals, and they could enjoy Bible studies and recreation too, and good Christian fellowship. So they just needed some place to go if they were Christians too, so that they could get together and feel safe, and also they could grow in the Lord. By 1844, the YMCA was established in England. The improvement of the spiritual condition of the young men was the motto. So to aid in the improvement of the spiritual condition of the young men, the Young Men's Christian Association, YMCA. It soon spread across the Atlantic to America. Lord Ashley, 1801 to 1885. He was the Earl of Shaftesbury, and a member of Parliament. And he worked tireless for compassionate treatment of mentally handicapped and reformed laws concerning the insane. So people that were mentally handicapped in those areas, he worked to help them because they basically were out on the streets, many of them. He promoted several laws to ease the difficult conditions in the factories too, and he lowered the work days to 10-hour days. You know, before they could work as many hours as they wanted to work them, but now only 10-hour days. Now it's down to 8-hour days. Laws were passed prohibiting women and children to work in dangerous occupations such as coal mining or chimney sweeping. So you couldn't take children and put them up your chimney to sweep your chimneys, or you couldn't take children to work in the mines, or women. Lord Ashley also presided over the ragged schools. The ragged schools were those which were impoverished schools, and he fed and educated 300,000 destitute children. So amazing, and he's a member of Parliament. Lord Ashley. The education. Most of Britain's schools were run by Christian organizations. Christians provided the founding of Sunday schools, which they called in the ragged schools for the poor, Sunday schools and ragged schools, and monetarial schools, which compensated for the lack of qualified teachers by training older children to help teach the younger children. So since they didn't have so many teachers, especially in the ragged schools of poverty, they would have, the older children, they teach them to help with the younger children in the school. So they had quite a few children. Look at this picture here. In 1870, the British opened tax support for the public schools, but still 3/4 of the schools were still private schools. And all schools were taught the gospel. All schools were taught religion. Christianity affects medical care in the nursing profession. I love this too, as a nurse myself. So, of course, we have the great Florence Nightingale, and she lived 1820 to 1910. She was the daughter of a wealthy Christian family in England, and she chose to become a nurse. Well, nursing at that time was an occupation practiced by uneducated women, and often women that were intemperate. That means they had tempers, let's say, and they weren't really controlled. So after receiving training in Germany in nursing, she returned to Britain, where she single-handedly created the modern nursing profession. Yes, she's a great woman. During the Crimean War, which was 1854 to 1856, we'll talk about that later, Florence Nightingale and her nurses became widely respected and admired for their devotion to care for the sick and wounded soldiers. So they loved her, and they loved her nurses. And she drastically improved the wretched conditions in the army hospitals. So she went to the army hospitals, she improved it and cleaned up the hospital, and made everything not only clean, but spiritually too. And because she did present the gospel too. In 1860, she was called the Lady with the Lamp, as she was known, and she opened the first school for nurses. She opened the first school for nurses in England. Florence Nightingale worked the remainder of her life as an advocate for better health care in the medical profession in England. What a great lady. A nation exalted by righteousness. So we're going to end up here. So think of this. Think of Queen Victoria and her reign. England reaped double blessing, as Proverbs 29:2 and 14:34 say. You know, the blessings came from the top because she said, I will do good. Here when she was a young girl and became queen, to us, she grew during those 64 years there. The blessings of a righteous ruler. Blessings that is a promise to a nation whose people live by the principles of righteousness. Righteousness exalts a nation. To sum up England at this time, one word would be morality. Why? Because everyone wanted to do good. Not everyone, but there was a lot of people that wanted to do good, at least in the political realm. The Victorians aspired to live moral lives according to the Bible. Their high standards enabled them to excel in science, industry, literature, and politics in a way that is still admired today. Righteousness exalted a nation. Hey, so we'll go on to the next section on England, section 2. So that's the end of this.